Kagurabachi Chapter 88 is here, so let's dive straight into it. Alright, so Chapter 88 is titled The First Step, and we pick up with Wolverine of the Kamunabi, who I actually remembered. We do know this guy's name. It's Izaru, but Wolverine might be a bad habit to break here. But we pick up with him still in the barrier force field room of the Kamunabi with the guy with the huge device on his head that's controlling all of the fortifications and force fields. And Izaru says, "Where are the Hishaku right now?" And the barrier guy says, "There's five of them on the west wing, fifth level." And Izaru says, "After we went through all of the trouble of inviting them to the threat elimination grounds where they could cut loose to their heart's content, why couldn't they just go that way? Well, we have no choice. Contact all of the elite troops." And we again get a panel that references all of these elite Kamunabi fighters that we heard of several chapters back. The barrier operator then says, "But we still haven't identified the informants. We don't know who the traitors are." And Wolverine says, "There's no time to waste. We'll just issue the command and we have to watch how everyone behaves. All lower ranking members are still ordered to remain in place." And the barrier operator says, "And the elite forces?" And Izaru says, "We'll attack toward the west and keep them away from the center. It's all right if there's damage to the building. Whatever it takes, we have to eradicate the Hishaku." We then cut to Yura and the Hishaku, who, if you recall, have basically just teleported right behind Hakari and URUHA. And Yura looks at URUHA and says, "He wasn't supposed to be alive." And he thinks to himself, "That damn Samura." And URUHA looks to Hakari and says, "Hakari, can you fight?" And he says, "Yes." And URUHA says, "Are you sure?" And Hakari says, "Somewhat. I can cast ESO every so often, but I used a string of strong spells, so I kind of need to rest. I can still transport, though, but all of the things I registered in the past have been reset." And URUHA says, "Great summary." And a little aside here, that's very interesting that he basically has to start anew with his registries. That is a good way to kind of nerf him for the level of the story right now, so I actually like that. URUHA then thinks to himself, "There's 7 enemies in front and in back, because we've got these 5, and then if you recall, we have the 2 other Hishaku members who were originally like pursuing Hakari from a few chapters back." So URUHA continues and thinks, "I'll need to stay close to the boy. I'll protect him and destroy them at the same time." Then the 2 other Hishakus, so not the main 5 here, like kind of lurch forward toward Hakari and URUHA. And he screams, "Excellent, bring it on." But as he's saying that, he basically gets cleaved in two. We then see this girl drop down from the ceiling above. What she had done was cleave through the floor on her level to make an opening. And in cleaving that hole, she carved that Hishaku dude in half, and then she kind of just falls down to join URUHA and Hakari, and they're both like completely shocked at this. But we do get a reaction panel of Yura, and he doesn't seem to have much of a reaction, which is kind of interesting. And so URUHA sees her fall down, and he goes, "Kiri?" And Hakari's like, "Who's that?" And Kiri says, "URUHA? I thought you were dead." And Hakari thinks to himself, "Just URUHA, not Mr. URUHA, so no formalities." And URUHA says, "Well, see for yourself. I'm alive." And she says, "Wow, that's a nice surprise." And she thinks to herself, "That's so aloof, like to reveal you're alive." And Hakari is thinking to himself, "Who is this?" And URUHA is thinking to himself, "Let me introduce her." And he says, "The progenitor of the white purity style was Itsuo Shirakai Sensei. This is his grandchild, the Izaru squad's Kiri Shirakai." And I might be pronouncing Shirakai incorrectly. Y'all let me know. But we then get a panel back to this guy who was introduced a little while back, again, as the inventor of the EI White Purity style. And the narrator says, or excuse me, URUHA kind of narrates and says, "This is Shirakai Sensei. He's left me half dead 4 times." And we see, like, in this flashback, Sensei says, "Look after my grandchild for a while," aka Kiri. "If you make her cry, I'll slaughter you." And URUHA's narration continues as we get like a flashback of a younger him and a younger Samura like trying to entertain this young Kiri. And he says, "The master permitted us to babysit her often." And we get like a flash of a young girl saying, "I'm hungry." And so Samura says, "Go get something to drink." Meanwhile, URUHA's like, "I'm on it." And then we get more narration where he says, "I'm grateful for that." And we get kind of like a side panel from Hakari saying, wow, Mr. Aruha expressing thanks. And then we get another panel of the sensei where Aruha says, Shirake sensei is currently missing. And in this flashback, he says, I'm bored of fighting people. Maybe a bear, a big bear. And Aruha continues, he's probably living out in the mountains somewhere. He's impossible to contact. And then we get an aside from Kiri who says, he texts me. And then we see a text from him that says, you doing good? And Aruha says, wow, he's never that nice to us. And we see her response, which is, I'm good. You live a long life, Grandpa. And Hakari says, oh, you're such a nice grandchild. And Kiri says, duh, at least until I kill the old bastard. And Hakari says, what? And then we get another flashback of the sensei where he says, swords are for men. They're too heavy for a woman's slender arms. You'd be dead in no time. Then Kiri says, Grandpa's a total male chauvinist pig when it comes to the sword. I want him alive and kicking until I get the chance to beat him up. So just for reference, the way I'm reading that was that like it didn't really happen. It was kind of like a fourth wall break to explain the dynamic to us, the audience. Because I don't think that like the Hishaku were just sitting there while they had that pleasant conversation in flashback. But y'all let me know how you took it. So anyway, that all happens, and then Aruha says, Kiri, this is Hakari. And Kiri says, nice to meet you, Hakari. But then all of the sudden, Bandage Face of the Hishaku just has darted toward Aruha and is right up behind him. But Aruha clocks this happening. You then see Aruha spin around and kick Bandage Face. He does manage to throw up an arm to block it at the last second, but still he gets flung. This is a massively powerful kick. He explodes through the wall next to them and probably several others. There's like a huge explosion from this kick. And Hakari looks at Aruha after he does that and he goes, a kick? Aruha has that kind of power? And then we see Aruha make this same pose like we saw him make at the end of the previous chapter. And he says, cone, crimson ritual. And Hakari is like, sorcery. We then pan over to the Hishaku where we see Best Genus looking kind of nervous and he says, that just landed. Meanwhile, Sideburns up here is like, there's no need to freak out. Look, we'll be fine. And then he starts casting sorcery of his own. He holds up his two hands and spirit energy starts floating between them and he says, Mako, aka Demon Bite. We then see what looks to be like one of those ceremonial dragon heads start to form in his palm. And then instantly there is a massive one that is lurching straight towards Hakari and Aruha. And Hakari's kind of like caught off guard by this, like, oh, but then Aruha is immediately locked in. He says, Kiri, look out for Hakari for me. And she says, you got it. And he grabs his blade and says, okay, time to go on the offensive. And then all we see is a slash mark across this thing's open jaw. We then get a cool perspective shot where we are looking through this cleave that Aruha just made in this dragon, and we can see the Hishaku on the other end of the hallway. And Yura just says, now. And then we see him reach behind, and another one of the Hishaku have opened up a book, and he reaches into the book and pulls out a sword. Like the text on the book is like sorcery and it starts like coalescing into the blade, and he literally pulls it from the pages and then meets Iruha like mid clash from his slash down the hallway. Really cool little sequence. So as they're clashing, Yura thinks to himself, his speed is intimidating, but he's lost a lot of the destructive force that he had before. His power enables him to fortify one ability at a time. Then we see that Iruha is thinking, okay, Chihiro is still holding back Mr. Samura. So out loud he says, the Hishaku, impressive, coming out to do your own dirty work. Did you run out of tricks to kill the sword bearers? And Yura says, hey, we're running out of time. I'd appreciate you not getting in our way. And Iruha just says, wait, what? And then we cut to Best Genus, who says, Yura, they keep coming. Iruha then says, you know where you are. You're in the middle of the hive now. There are plenty of people besides me who will get in your way. And Yura says, true. In this place, there are all sorts of people. Then Yura's eyes go clouded and black, just like they did during the coin flip last chapter. And he continues and says, our job is to create momentary confusion. Nothing more. And Iruha gets like shocked at this. And then we get a panel of the Sword Saint's eyes being the same like dark and cloudy. And Iruha says, you. We then cut to Sideburns Hishaku, who is once again using his sorcery, except this time he is creating these dragon heads, forming all around them and surrounding Hakari and Kiri. We then cut back to URUHA and Yura's eyes are now seemingly back to normal, but they are still like fiercely locked in on each other, and Yura says, "We still have a card to play, the death match." We then have a final shot of Hakari and Kiri being surrounded by all of these dragon heads, and Kiri steps in front of Hakari and says, "Step back." And that's where the chapter ends. All right, really interesting chapter. The main thing that stuck out to me is this eye thing happening again, and URUHA specifically clocking it to like remind him of the Swordmaster, right? I'm not entirely sure what to make of that paneling. Like, was showing the Sword Saint in that moment just symbolizing URUHA's recognition of those eyes? Or was it showing like in that moment that there was a literal connection between them in that moment? And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this just because literally yesterday I put out a 20-minute video where we talk about Yura and the Sword Saint. So check that out instead of me just, saying the same stuff here. But that only lends more credence to the theory that there is something going on between the two of them. But exactly what shape that's taking is still hard to say, but very interesting. Also interesting, the phrasing of "we have a card to play, the death match," especially in tandem with the coin flip last time, right? Cards are often used in gambling, right? So I wonder if that's like some sort of hint as to his sorcery, or I don't know. It's still too many unknowns here, but very curious to see what the actual plan is here, because he said we're only here to cause a distraction, basically. So like this truly seems maybe about just busting out the Sword Saint or giving him a window to escape his prison or something like that, which again only further cements the connection between the two. But is it enemies using enemies because they have a mutual goal, or is there a deeper alignment than that? Anyways, go watch the 20-minute video from yesterday for more. Also, we seemingly got a peek at what URUHA's sorcery is, Crimson Ritual, and it seemed like those marks on his face started bleeding, so I don't know if he's like blood manipulation in some form or fashion, like he's enhancing himself. But what Yura speculated was that he can only enhance one thing at a time, so perhaps his sorcery is like buffing himself in certain ways. I don't know. Let me know if you guys took anything from this. Also, very quickly, just a moment of silence for our boy Bandage Face's aura. Going from last chapter where he was lauded as the strongest member of the Hishaku to getting one shot by URUHA. Now, I don't think he truly was one shot. I don't think we've seen the last of him. I think he'll be back. We did see a panel that he blocked it, even though he got, sent through 3 city blocks. Just, I'm sure not the showing he wanted, but I'm still expecting a lot out of this guy. And then finally, we had the introduction of Kiri, and this was really cool. Her massive sword cleaving a guy in two in her first impression here. But more interestingly, we've got more generational kind of trauma to explore, because she is the granddaughter of Itsuo Shiraki, the creator of the White Purity style, which means she's obviously very familiar with URUHA and Samura, and they even babysat her as a kid. But what's interesting is that her grandfather is missing right now. So that feels a little spicy for sure. Like, I can't wait to just find out more about the political landscape of the world at large, because I definitely think there's something more than just like he went to go fight a bear, right? But we find out that he's like misogynistic, chauvinist pig, doesn't think women belong in swordplay, which makes me think probably obviously that she is not a user of the White Purity style, right? She probably is using some other style, because I doubt her grandfather would teach her based on his views, right? And so her whole thing is she wants to prove to him how wrong he is, and like she wants to be the one to put him in his place and defeat him. So I can't wait to see kind of how all of these things are explored. Anyways, that's going to do it for this one, y'all. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments or over in the Discord. And as always, thank you for watching.